So, another few seconds. We are live on YouTube.
Cool. Ganz herzlich willkommen zu diesem Event der Ringvorlesung Gesundheit, Gesellschaft in der Krise. Mein Name ist Thomas Bayer. Heute ist Frau Kollegin Preinsack leider aus beruflichen Gründen verhindert, weil es darum geht, weitere Talente an die Uni Wien zu holen, Berufungskommissionssitzung. Und ich freue mich, Sie in das Programm kurz einführen zu dürfen. Wie bekannt beschäftigt sich diese Ringvorlesung mit dem Thema Krisen in der Gesundheit, Krisen in der Gesellschaft. Und wir haben die verschiedenen Referentinnen bisher gebeten, über eine Begriffsdefinition ganz am Anfang hin zu einer Beschreibung des Status quo zu kommen. Was haben wir für Implikationen erlebt in der Wirtschaft, in der Wissenschaft, im Bereich der Künste und begeben uns jetzt, nachdem wir eine Bestandsaufnahme gemacht haben, hin zu möglichen Wegen aus dieser Krise. Was können wir dabei eventuell auch lernen aus vorangegangenen Krisen? Wie können wir das umsetzen? Und insofern freue ich mich sehr, auf die heutige Referentin hinzuweisen, die noch gleich näher eingeführt wird von der Frau Kollegin Janina K., Universitätsprofessorin für Medizin, Anthropologie und Global Health an der Uni Wien, die unsere Gastreferentin wahrscheinlich viel, viel besser kennt, obwohl ich auch schon Gelegenheit hatte, ihr einmal zuzuhören. Und das Thema der heutigen Ringvorlesung ist genau dieser erste Sprung in einen Status quo, Wege aus der Krise. Was sind gesellschaftliche Antworten auf Gesundheitskrisen? Und ich darf in dem Zusammenhang noch auf das Referat vom letzten Woche hinweisen von Frau Kelly, die eine globale Perspektive auf Gesundheitskrisen gegeben hat. Und ich glaube, dass wir sehr viele Überschneidungen da heute sehen werden. Ich begrüße auch die Zuhörerinnen von dem Standard YouTube-Channel und darf noch erinnern, dass wenn Sie Fragen haben, das sehr gerne in dem Q&A-Tool zu tun, das wir observieren werden während dieses Referates. Und ich freue mich und übergebe das Wort und auch ein Change in the Language to Frau Professor Kehr. Danke.
Yes, thank you very much, Thomas Bayer, for the introduction, and welcome to everybody from my side too. So my name is Janina Kerr. I'm very pleased to be here for this Ringvorlesung. So today's topic is locking down on us, societal responses to health crises. And so the question we are looking at today is how were societal responses to health crises in the past? How is public health involved in shaping society and politics? And how can we build maybe also solidarity within public health? And what is great today is that we have a guest who is a historian of medicine and human rights. So I think we will be provided with a much needed historical perspective to better situate and hopefully also understand what the contemporary crisis is about. And as Thomas said, how we can maybe act on it. So it's an immense pleasure and honor to welcome Professor Sara Silverstein. So a warm welcome, Sara. Sara Silverstein has been assistant professor at the University of Conneticut since 2018. Before that, she held a range of positions. She has been a postdoctoral research associate at the Yale Jackson Institute for Global Affairs, a Fox Fellow at Sciences Po Paris, a junior visiting fellow at the Institut für die Gesellschaft for Menschenrechte right here in Vienna. And she has a very spread out training. She also a PhD from Yale University, a master in modern European history from the University of Oxford, and a BA in literature from Dartmouth College. So Sara has really widely worked on the history of global health and the history of human rights and how both intertwine. So she's particularly interested in human rights questions concerning refugees, statelessness and migration, but also human rights issues in general. So currently, she told me she begins a new short book project on the history of health as a human right, more of a general overview. So where actually does this right to health that we take so much for granted, especially in Western Europe, come from. So maybe more importantly for the topic of today, though, is that she's completing a book manuscript, which we're looking very much forward to, on the history of global health in the interwar period. And Sara therein looks at the dynamics of state constructions actually in Eastern Europe and how this influenced international institutions in the domain of health. So there's this very strong link between politics and health that we have observed, of course, during the COVID pandemic too. So her book manuscript is entitled Your Health and Ours, International History of Universal Health. And what she does in the book is that she follows individuals, institutions, and ideas around questions of universal health in very different locations. So she's in Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia, as these states were called back then. And she also looks at how people got involved in China and what they learned of community health there, and how this, back again, influences their ideas and activities in Eastern Europe. So to do all this work, Sara actually went to 28 archives in 7 countries, among them the League of Nations Archive in Geneva, the Rockefeller Archive in New York City, but also she went and thought out private papers and collections in Zagreb and Paris. So as you will see, to tell these global histories, that only works if we look and pay attention to detail and accounts of the local, which comes with a lot of empirical work. And so Sara has done this work, particularly in relation to Eastern Europe. And I think this is very interesting to us being here in Vienna, of course, which sits at the intersection of East and West. So thanks again, Sara. A very welcome to you. Your talk will be around 45 minutes. And then, as always, we have ample time for questions and hopefully fruitful discussions in the Q&A, but also just raise your hand and ask your questions. So the floor is yours. I'm very much looking forward to your talk.
Thank you for that very kind introduction, and I'm very pleased to be joining you today. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to discuss this topic. And as you'll see in my talk, I'm going to try to take a somewhat unexpected angle on this question of locking down on society and the ways that society responds to public health crises and develops more long-term solutions to public health issues through collaborative initiatives. So the institutions that protect public responsibility for health emerged in the 19th and 20th centuries in response to a range of public health crises. These crises included epidemics like cholera, influenza, typhus that required emergency measures, and then that these emergency measures eventually contributed to building more permanent institutions. And this transition occurred through an exchange between official public health procedures and the responses of the people. Part of this exchange was in the relationship between government authorities and the general population. The people themselves shaped the acceptable extent of government control. Another part of this exchange was in the relationship between the people themselves. This included the ways in which they supported one another and contributed to their community's health. This was public health through civil society and public health activities, reinforcing in turn those ties of civil society. So it was very cyclical. Over the past 2 years, much of our focus has, of course, been on ways in which public health measures have limited individual freedoms. These limitations, as we are very familiar with them, included closed borders, lockdowns, quarantines, and mandates for masking and vaccination. And as we're also very familiar in our different countries, these restrictions have been at the center of heated political debates. Historically, this dynamic is not uncommon. In times of public health crisis, people sacrifice some personal freedoms to preserve both public safety and their own personal security. It is not uncommon that these issues become political. It has also not been uncommon for this politicization to lead to xenophobic accusations against marginalized or minority communities. Boccaccio described the breakdown of public life and laws in his account of the Black Plague in Florence in the 14th century in terms that sound very familiar to the sorts of debates that we've heard circulating during the last couple of years of the COVID pandemic. Public health expanded as a form of security for both the state and its citizens in the 19th century. Public health measures likewise instructed populations in behaviors expected of modern citizens. Growing scientific understanding of infectious disease prompted new public works and government intervention in preventative health measures. The cholera epidemic in 1854 in London famously led John Snow to map the spread of disease and identify the Broad Street pump as a source of infection. His methods contributed to London's reworking of its water and waste systems. And then public health inspired questions regarding the state's responsibility for the well-being of its citizens, and also complicated evolving concepts of personal duties and freedoms within a political society. In many cases of public health, such as sewers, street cleaning, safe water, it involved public works that required government management. It raised expectations of services from the government in exchange for taxes and participation in certain prescribed hygienic behaviors. Other measures, such as quarantine and compulsory vaccination, required legislation and enforcement mechanisms. Epidemic controls and coercive measures remained the form of public health most common for colonial subjects and other less favored populations into the 20th century. Quarantine that affected trade through maritime ports and labor laws that impacted production brought public health into international relations as well. Public health measures were closely associated with the political form of the state. Ideological differences influenced priorities and methods in public health, but the government's handling of disease and public reactions to those measures also shaped the state's political development. In Britain, an environmentalist approach, which involves working with sewers and attention to living conditions versus more widespread quarantine, and reactions against compulsory smallpox vaccination, for example, helped define that country's particular form of liberalism. In the Habsburg Empire, the control of epidemics intersected with the emerging politics of nationalism and contributed to altering the empire's governing structure. In the 1830s, when centralized Austrian measures proved ineffective against cholera, Bohemian initiatives advocated a sanitationist approach that devolved greater authority to the local level. Following the failed national revolutions of 1848, which occurred during another cholera epidemic, the empire adopted smaller districts as an official health policy so that more initiative was coming from those local levels and there was more local collaboration in community health. A subsequent Imperial Health Act redrew these districts and made them the basis for a promise that there would be public health in every village in the empire. The Ministry of Public Health and Physical Education also opened a branch office in Prague in an effort to somewhat decentralize from Vienna. Public health both provoked opposition by violating individual liberties with compulsory measures and also emerged as a tool in building participatory citizenship. In all its forms, it represented the most intimate relationship between the state and its people, involving the body, birth, illness, fitness, sex, and death. States learned their limits of control when they mandated quarantine or medical examinations or vaccinations or institutionalized treatments. Citizens learned to weigh protections against the personal freedoms that they compromised and to understand actions such as vaccination as choices they made for the public good. Vaccine mandates have long been the center of controversy and an indication of how far a government can go in demanding compliance of its citizens. In the 19th century, a small minority protested the introduction of a mandatory smallpox vaccine in Britain. The basis for this objection was an alignment of two separate interests, one commercial and one religious. Prior to the introduction of the smallpox vaccine, inoculators made a career of inoculating against smallpox by introducing small amounts of active virus to their clients. This practice was safer than contracting smallpox, but immensely more risky than vaccination. Britain therefore outlawed inoculation in favor of vaccination, leading to protests against vaccination from people who had made their livelihoods through inoculation. A religious minority objected to vaccination because it used the cowpox virus, and they argued that it was unnatural to introduce something that belonged to cattle into the human body. The religious and commercial objections each promoted skepticism of the science. Images circulated of people becoming part bovine after vaccination with cowpox. Through this alignment between commercialism and a small religious sect, a vocal minority of the population led the government to limit its vaccine mandate. This pattern of vocal minority restricting public health legislation has occurred repeatedly. These stories of opposition to public health controls tells a dramatic story, but it also obscures the story of the majority. What people less frequently address is the way in which public health expands freedom and builds civic solidarity rather than creating political divisions. So today I'm going to challenge the reputedly axiomatic narrative of public health and social division by looking at how civil society figured in public health projects in the period between the 1920s and 1940s. The particular examples that I'm going to look at will show us how public health contributed to building local civil society through participation in community health. We will also see the relationship between that local society and a civic national identity as part of democratic experiments. Ultimately, there is also a global connection to this local story. Local public health projects involving civil society contributed to building international health institutions based on the idea of international civil society that similarly pursued activities based in these shared values. So first, I will look at the use of public health to advance the idea of civic nationality in the new post-imperial European states after the First World War. I will focus in particular on a rural health project in Yugoslavia's Macedonian region. Part of the question involved in this history had to do with the role of the state. Public health reformers involved in democratic experiments in the new states that were formed from the Paris Peace Conference in 1919 were clear that the state had a responsibility for public health and healthcare. Any idea that there wasn't a public responsibility, that it was that medicine should be left to private care, they said belonged to the 19th century. They also believed that public health was absolutely necessary for democracy to function. Part of that argument was about health in relation to political economics, to healthy workers participating in the economy. But they also argued that health was necessary for participation in democracy. And they argued that health was necessary to the social equality that they believed was the basis for a functioning democracy. Once health became a civil right, they argued, everyone would be equal. They also believed that public health projects could teach people about what democracy could offer to them and teach them to participate in democratic institutions. So our first case study is, as I mentioned, the region of Macedonia in interwar Yugoslavia. The Macedonian Rural Health Project was part of an experiment in democracy and an effort to build a Yugoslav civic national identity that incorporated all of the different national identities within this new Yugoslav state. This region was officially the southernmost part of Serbia. The government in Belgrade tried to deny the existence of a separate region that called Macedonia, as part of an effort to deny that a Macedonian nationality even existed. The Paris Peace Conference in 1919 also refused to recognize a Macedonian nationality, which meant that it was not covered under the minority treaty that Yugoslavia signed. This Macedonian region was economically impoverished, it was ethnically diverse, and it was resistant to rule from Belgrade. The central government used the military to control the region and tried to alter the demography by settling military veterans and their families in this territory. In 1924, Yugoslavia's first director of public health chose Macedonia as the first region in which to develop his new plans for a rural health project. The person leading this initiative was named Andrija Štempar. Štempar was Croatian and had graduated from the University of Vienna Medical School in 1911. At the time, the Habsburg Empire did not permit the establishment of medical schools in its Balkan territories, so most medical students from the region studied in Vienna. There, he had been an ardent student of Julius Tandler and Ludwig Teleki, who placed Vienna at the forefront of thinking in social medicine. Social medicine involved an awareness of social, economic, and environmental determinants of health and disease. It also suggested that public health services that incorporated social medicine might diminish inequalities and social injustices. Later, Štempar would develop this theory to say that doctors must learn to dissect society to understand disease as they had learned to dissect bodies. Štempar criticized his professors for failing to understand that these social, economic, and environmental conditions were different in the Balkan provinces and generally in the empire's different regions than they were in the imperial capital. More generally, he observed that the Viennese theories of social medicine focused on urban and industrial health. They did not know how to address the specific conditions and concerns of rural communities. When he became director of public health in Yugoslavia, he focused on adapting the practice of social medicine to rural health, and he considered how conditions varied across the new country's different regions. The Macedonian Public Health Project proceeded gradually, encouraging small projects at local levels. These centers often began by addressing the environmental issues that affected health. Urban public health began frequently with questions of sanitation, clean water, overcrowding, and industrial diseases. Rural public health's basic concerns were similar. Rural disease control often began with animal husbandry, clean and adequately aired living spaces free of cohabitation with animals and from cooking smoke, and access to adequate and clean water. Štempar chose Macedonia to be the first site of Yugoslavia's rural health project, in part because it was politically unsettled, and in part because of the severity of infectious health conditions associated with water management in the region. Macedonia had the highest rate of malaria in Yugoslavia and possibly in Europe. Malaria was associated with economic depression and consequently with the political instability in the region as well. He chose Macedonia because of another wave of political unrest and resistance to the government's existing efforts at so-called quote-unquote pacification. He had an idea that public health could diffuse national tensions by supporting democratic participation and build a civic national identity through shared values and activities based around health. He argued that what they needed to do instead was develop the active participation of the people in public health initiatives. This participation would develop experience with democratic practices, and it would show the people that they could expect services from the government, that it wasn't just about paying taxes, and that they could even choose and request the services that they wanted. Štempar noted that health work was good for making people aware of the government's activities. He acknowledged that the most significant challenge often lay in securing the people's trust, that they had a systemic lack of trust in the government in Belgrade, and that they had no precedent for trusting any government or for believing that any government would do anything beneficial for them. They resisted being controlled or taxed by a distant government in Belgrade that they perceived to be foreign, but Štěmpár hoped they would contribute more readily to services that they themselves requested from the government and from which they benefited directly. He wanted the people to learn that government officials brought more than tax forms. Democracy was a learned skill and one that the health program structures intentionally reinforced. These democratic principles emerged through attempts to build popular support for public health programs. Štěmpár closely associated democratic practices with the popularization of medicine and said that his program's success depended on, quote, the goodwill of the people, and he could only go as far as they will let him, unquote. Communities in Macedonia exhibited mixed reactions toward this program. Public health officials often represented the first contact that rural villages had with the central government. And in fact, this was the case in other new post-imperial states in Eastern Europe as well during this period. The village well was often the first contact that community had with the new Yugoslav government. So the health workers in general were the first contact other than the tax forms and the military. And the village well was most particularly within public health, the point of contact. The Macedonia Rural Health Project commonly started with thinking about water. Access to clean water was a particularly practical early step that had a noticeable effect on the lives of the local populations. In Macedonia, water was generally plentiful, but often lethal. It was necessary for the rice crops that were a staple of the lowlands economy. But the same swamps that made rice a viable crop were also malarial breeding grounds. Water issues often correlated to the region's cash crops, directly connecting public health with agricultural development. And the public health programs, in fact, transformed the entire landscape. It wasn't just about the interactions with the village or with the individual people, but the public health programs were involved in the landscape itself, with draining swamps and stagnant water, coating the standing water with oil or an insecticide called Paris green, encouraging modern irrigation and introducing new crops to diminish dependence on rice, as well as planting trees to reverse erosion and absorb water. Making clean water accessible in all villages was another part of the program. The health project invested in digging wells and constructing public baths and laundries that made use of that water. The new resources for simplifying personal hygiene proved to be popular amongst local inhabitants. Providing clean water and facilities for making use of it established the public health project's credibility in many of these villages. Malaria was not the only disease that thrived in Macedonia's water. Rain-fed standing water was the only source of drinking water in many villages, and some had only rainwater collection points for their drinking water. Typhoid was a persistent problem, and dysentery and other gastrointestinal illnesses were common. This most basic necessity was also a relentless threat. The Department of Health constructed model demonstration villages with wells and associated public water facilities. The health officials that waited for requests from villages for assistance before they established the facilities that were preferred by the villages. So they functioned by responding to specific requests. So requests might come in for a well or a public bath. Those were among the most common. And then the public health program would expand by responding to those requests. Public water projects proceeded where the communities themselves also contributed something toward the effort. This contribution sometimes took the form only of land or labor, but the idea was that it demonstrated the community's interest in the project, its investment in the project, and showed them the significance of their collaboration with the public health initiatives. Such a system of exchange built on familiar forms of barter for health services that had been common in this region. Local populations had become accustomed already to exchanging labor for the quinine that had been used and still was used to treat malaria. Some towns paid the full cost of digging the new water systems, while the Ministry of Health supplied the digging apparatus and the pipes. So the type of contribution or exchange varied between labor, supplies, money, but it was always a collaboration. Contributing toward the projects helped communities come to terms with receiving something from a governmental authority. The town of Strumica was in the territory transferred from Bulgaria to Yugoslavia in 1919. It had experienced intense violence during the Second Balkan War in 1913, and it had been the subject of an aggressive Bulgarian nationalization campaign. Despite this, or perhaps even because of it, the town was now fiercely Macedonian. The legacies of colonialism and imperialism varied across the regions of Yugoslavia, and Macedonia's post-colonial character was emerging in its exchanges with the new state. Yugoslav district officials visiting this town of Strumica concluded that the people were highly suspicious of government interest in them. Similar reports came from elsewhere. The people would not accept anything from the government, which was attributed to their fear that it would not actually be free, but would become an excuse for subsequent government extortion. In Strumica, as elsewhere, the people distrusted the Yugoslav government and protested their taxes. Nevertheless, the community contributed 145,000 dinars to pipe water from 3 kilometers away. The Ministry of Health contributed, in contrast, 100,000 dinars, and the Ministry of Agriculture contributed 250,000. The community objected to taxes, but paying toward a well was something that they did for themselves in cooperation with the state. The Ministry of Health used the same model for developing health centers in the region. It paid for the professional staff, equipment, and certain materials to construct the requested services, while expecting the village community to provide the land on which buildings would stand. Building materials such as stone and cement, transportation for supplies, and labor were all the sorts of things that these communities were contributing. Altogether, the ministry's monetary investment was often less than the local contributions totaled. The wells and public water facilities and the malarial control stations helped public health workers to win the trust of local inhabitants. In the example of one town with a population of 4,000, they'd only had rainwater to drink before a well was dug in 1926. The town paid the full cost of digging the well, which was 10,000 dinars, and the Ministry of Health supplied the pipes. A year later, townspeople told visitors that since the well was dug, they were free from the regular gastrointestinal ailments that they recalled from before. They walked as far as 7 kilometers to get water from this particular well. A number of communities around Lake Ohrid reported a similar experience. The area had recently suffered serious typhoid outbreaks. In one village of only 300 people, 20 of them had died of typhoid a few years before. Then, in several towns and villages of the region, local inhabitants contributed labor toward establishing new water supplies, with the Ministry of Health providing digging apparatus and pipes. There had been no cases of typhoid since the well was dug. In the general area of Struga, typhoid fever had been endemic, and the town itself had been typical for 20 people to die of the disease each year. In July of 1927, following the construction of wells, no cases of typhoid had yet been reported for the year, and a steady stream of people could be seen filling their jugs from these wells. Public baths and laundries were also popular with local populations. In Prilep, a bath opened in May 1927, and so many baths were taken within the subsequent month that the water supply gave out under the demand and the well had to be deepened. Public laundries and baths in Struga and other towns also reported high usage rates. The Department of Public Health thought that this was, quote, a kind of public health that the people can understand, unquote. Public water helped change people's perceptions of government. An illustrative anecdote from an outside observer who didn't know about these policies came from the English novelist Rebecca West, who toured Macedonia a decade after the Public Health Project began. In her travelogue, she recorded a village's excitement over the arrival of a petty government official who was acting as her tour guide. The people were thrilled to have someone finally arrive to whom they could appeal their conflict over water rights with the neighboring village. The two villages, which were characterized by different nationalities, had feuded violently for generations, but now they sought and trusted government intervention. After applying for mediation, the villagers took the opportunity to express their opinions on a range of the country's political questions to the civil servant from Belgrade who'd showed up in their town. This population showed a conviction that government officials worked for the people, that the state would intervene fairly in the concerns of village life, and that the people had a right to a voice in politics. As in the case of clean water, public health programs that focused on malaria had the benefit of winning favor for public health work amongst the local populations. In new health stations, work would begin on a limited basis, targeting malaria. Health officials believed that the treatment of malaria helped establish confidence amongst the people, preparing them to take advantage of the transition to more general health clinics. Strumitsa's malaria station opened in 1924, and by 1927, it was preparing to transition toward a more general public health clinic. Its 3 years of operation had witnessed a marked decline in malaria in the region, and the physician in charge attributed the people's growing trust in public health work to their experience of decreased malaria and waterborne illnesses. The clean water supply toward which the community had contributed was incidentally attached to this clinic, so that there was a close association between the supply of clean water and the provision of public health and healthcare through this clinic. Beginning with malaria control also had the benefit of support from the government beyond the health ministry. The Central Yugoslav government was particularly concerned with the problem of malaria, and Stempar therefore considered that he was able to secure funds for anti-malaria work, while he considered that he probably wouldn't have been successful in doing so if he had applied immediately to the government for funds to work with general public health. So this targeted initiative around malaria built up trust both within the general population and also within the government at the same time. Managing the water altered agricultural customs in the region as well and accompanied the introduction of new crops. A combination of familiar and convenient new agricultural techniques helps build support for the malaria control, so that it wasn't always an immediate sort of foreign intervention in the region, but built from strategies and techniques that were already familiar and adapted them and expanded them to the purpose of controlling malaria. So rather than extensive government legislation dictating particular behavior or standards, the public health department left many of the daily logistics to their local representatives, who developed authority in their own ways and adapted to the vicinity's specific conditions. Not all locals responded favorably to this imposition. Some demanded compensation for treatment of their lands, such as when officials oiled ponds. The Public Health Department's official strategy in such situations was to continue to favor cooperation and education over coercion. They built on the commonplace. One anti-malaria strategy involved using poisons such as creosoles in wells and tanks, and other enclosed standing water. And many local people were very suspicious of these poisons being introduced into their water supplies. So in the case of a variation adapting to local conditions, in Struga, they instead treated wells and tanks with copper sulfate, which was familiar to the locals because they already used it in their vineyards. Other measures that might not seem inconvenient or excessive to locals included creating a solid approach around animals' water sources so that hooves didn't churn up mud and leave depressions to collect water and attract mosquitoes. The Macedonia program incorporated a plan for general education as well as health education. Schools also became an institutional opening for introducing public health to a community. Where possible, the Macedonia project would attach its health clinics to local schools. In addition to seeing the students, physicians would hold conferences with the mothers regarding their own health and that of their children. And they anticipated that the children would, quote, take what they learn into their homes, unquote. With surprising speed, the public health program won the trust of those it served in Macedonia. It built on all of these different strategies of the clean water supplies, of management, of management. Wow, I'm really losing my voice. Of management for water supplies and of the general public health institutions to build up this public health trust amongst the population. And Stempar explained their objective to be, quote, that each village in the country will have good water to drink, have access to public baths, and have the cultural and public health advantages which the health centers and stations have to offer, unquote. The public health department focused its attentions where they were wanted. As I mentioned at the beginning, they constructed the health centers and school clinics where the communities made favorable arrangements and indicated their interest not only in having these services provided, but actively participating in decisions around them. The Rural Health Project engaged the people of Macedonia in assuming control of their own health and made their participation part of building a multinational democratic agrarian state. This civil society participation became an important component of developing health institutions in Macedonia. It also influenced the form and development of national health institutions, including the development of public health and Ministry of Health and a series of public health schools and institutions. Stempar consciously used this network of institutions to decentralize Yugoslavia's public health system away from Belgrade and to make it more multinational. Individual and communal agency became the foundation for the Macedonia project and for all Stempar's work in the Department of Public Health, and later as a rural health expert for the League of Nations Health Organization. Stempar started referring to this approach as socialized medicine. The term confused people in the West, who used it to refer to Soviet centralized state medicine. What Stempar meant, though, was a health service functioning by way of civil society, local connections, free participation, and horizontal activity, all of which depended on and propagated social equality. Socialized medicine was the institutionalized practice of social medicine. It was a way of describing a public responsibility for health and healthcare. Stempar developed this concept through his activities as part of the League of Nations Health Organization, as well as through his own experience in Yugoslavia. The League of Nations Health Organization was the predecessor of the World Health Organization during the interwar years. It globalized the activity of public health by creating networks between rural health development projects in smaller agrarian states. This can be called an example of emerging international civil society. In particular, it took Stampar's Macedonian Rural Health Project as a model. Countries began to ask the League Health Organization to send advisors to assist in developing their public health systems, and Stampar was one of the lead experts they sent to respond to these requests, along with several other officials who had worked closely with him in Yugoslavia. Public health frequently formed part of state-building efforts during the interwar years. It was common across these states that were developing in Central and Eastern Europe after 1919. This history is often remembered for the role of eugenics in nationalist projects. However, public health also contributed to integrating a multinational society and contributing to these experiments in democracy and democratic participation. In one part, it extended the mechanisms of governance into diverse regions that now formed part of nation states. Elements of this practice reflected colonialist measures at times. However, the key difference was in how these public health projects engaged with citizenship. The realities of coercion versus participation were particularly clear when we see them in the contrast between citizens and colonial subjects. The idea of public health for citizens was that it invited the participation of the people. The public health belonged to them. The state supported it, but it was about collective activity. It was about citizenship as the relationship between the people themselves, and not only between an individual and the government. When Stampar joined the League of Nations Health Organization, he spent several years participating in rural health projects for the national government in China during the 1930s. His experience there influenced his thought about community health initiatives and communal public responsibility for health. One of his Chinese colleagues explained that colonial officials, quote, missed the true meaning of rural reconstruction. One of its purposes is citizenship, unquote. The cooperative societies and civic participation in public health were particular areas of Stampar's focus in China. He visited cooperatives organized by the non-governmental Chinese National Mass Education Association in Tingshan, which he considered to be a model for rural development. He recognized a lot of similarities between his experiences in Macedonia and what he saw in these community efforts in Tingshan. The mass education movement and the rural reconstruction movement that it inspired pursued a program of integrated socioeconomic reforms from a community foundation, emphasizing governmental integrity and popular participation. The mass education movement incorporated a community-based healthcare model that fostered an understanding of health as a collective effort. The province was divided under this system into 8 districts, each of which had its own center with village stations beneath these. Doctors from the district stations had a close relationship with the provincial health center and would spend a day each week attending lectures there and observing public health work and medical cases. At the village level, farmers received training in giving vaccinations and sharing public health information. They also assumed responsibility for notifying the health station above them of sickness, births, and deaths. So there was a lot of close integration between the different levels of healthcare provision and active involvement of the local community in healthcare initiatives. Stampar believed this program effectively extended the reach of care while stimulating popular interest in learning more about health. In Tingshan and elsewhere, Stampar noted the reach of health centers to the broadest population and the integration of health services with an evolving concept of active citizenship. The director of this health project, whose name is C.C. Chen, shared his conviction that organizing local health communities gave communities experience in self-government. Another colleague, Cheng-Fu Liang, explained that promoting citizenship through public health was central to the purpose of their work. Stempar measured the success of local participation in health on the same terms he had used in Macedonia, noting when it seemed that people voluntarily sought out health centers or rural welfare centers. He received reports that people would, for example, seek access to vaccines once they were available. The smallpox vaccination campaign was one indicator that public health workers used to measure success. The entire province of Tingxian recorded only 2 cases of smallpox in 1935. The mass education movement's health centers, Stempar explained to the League, put weight on people learning by example, trusting them to make the decision to participate. This method, he argued, was clearly more effective than coercive methods that he observed in other provinces' rural welfare activities. Through education rather than coercion, he argued that local populations would accept change and ultimately would demand the change themselves. The National Ministry of Health in China incorporated more of the mass education movement's health project, which Stempar encouraged. Here was another example of civic action ultimately contributing to the shape of national public health institutions. So now we're going to move on to one final example of civil society action around developing community public health. And this was in the displaced persons camps in Central Europe after the Second World War. These camps became the setting for building communal responsibility for social services that had been associated more with government involvement during the interwar years. Some form of emergency care was ubiquitous from the early days of liberation. It was not, however, always the result of official United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, or UNRWA, intervention. UNRWA's plans for health had focused in particular on epidemic threats, such as influenza and typhus. They had prepared to provide temporary medical relief to displaced persons, but expected to do so largely while the displaced persons were in transit, first to camps and quickly on toward repatriation. They warned their health officers against providing anything more substantial than emergency medicine, fearing that it would interfere with repatriation. UNRWA's planners had not expected that large numbers of displaced persons were going to refuse to repatriate. The second phase, however, once the DPs refused repatriation efforts, was the creation of health services, as it became increasingly evident that these camps were going to be more long-term establishments. These health services didn't function or exist in a static form. They weren't something that was planned from above and then implemented within the camps. Local needs and local initiatives directed them. Displaced persons took the first initiative in providing medical care in camps and staffing the hospitals. Doctors from among the displaced persons improvised emergency care, often while they were themselves sick with typhus and other camp diseases. A third phase evolved within this DP healthcare service. Long-term care for the chronically ill would challenge the international community to redefine a person's right to adequate treatment and would push the construction of practical institutions to protect those rights for the DPs within these camps. The methods and objectives of rehabilitation contributed to changing international cooperation in providing health services. The work of DP medical personnel drove these transformations, drawing on organizations prepared for such work by the international public health milieu during the interwar years. In this health service, the broadening expectation of access to healthcare in the interwar years met the evolving set of international health institutions to make possible a resourceful and impressively comprehensive program. Once again, responses to a public health crisis transition toward long-term health institutions through the participation of civil society and a focus on community health. This time, those health institutions were developing at an international level through UNRWA and then the International Refugee Organization, as well as being directed from this intensely localized set of initiatives. Experience with public health and public health institutions during the interwar decades, as I mentioned, shaped this post-war response. And relief for the refugees and displaced persons was clearly no longer the sort of emergency measure that was carried out following the First World War, for example. Nearly 3 decades of developing health services came back around to make this international public health care system respond to these local initiatives within the camps. And an international responsibility for health shifted toward guaranteeing healthcare for the individual person within his or her own particular community. This health service echoed the significance of population movements in the emergence of national health services after the First World War, and now is contributing to new sorts of thinking about international public health responsibilities. Effective methods from the earlier period continued to surface. So measures that were apparent in projects like Stempar's rural health initiative in Macedonia, the particular approaches to social medicine were evident in the approaches to rehabilitation within the DP camps, particular ideas about community, particular ideas about participation and about the decision-making of local populations was evident in the way that these camps functioned. And it was a type of behavior that was familiar to the international institutions that built up around them because they had been involved with it during that earlier period. So public health and public health care figured prominently in the particular activities that built a sense of civil activity within these camps. They chose to particularly focus on issues such as providing healthcare, providing food, water, childcare, all integrated within their initiatives. In some cases, this civic participation reinforced national identity within the camps as particular groups of nationals would work together, would form a particular community within a camp. But in other cases, it functioned as a type of multinational civil society. People in the camps had little agency over their lives or futures. Living conditions varied. Food was frequently rationed and inadequate, but they took control of the elements that they were able to direct themselves. So from this local initiative, briefly, for something about around half a decade, an actual international health service emerged. It protected the right of displaced persons to access healthcare. And it wasn't an institution planned from above. The institutional mechanisms functioned at an international level, but it was very much planned and directed from the local communities within the camps themselves. And it was an effort that was largely led by doctors who were themselves displaced persons or refugees. It arose from the necessities of the moment and from experience with public health and social medicine. It would ensure universal care for the displaced persons despite their stateless and destitute conditions. The standard of care would surpass that its patients would receive if they repatriated to their home countries. And it challenged health systems in receiving countries such as Germany, Britain, and Israel to match the level of care that was being provided within these camps. In these years following the Second World War, a United Nations Commission debated the terms of a new social contract of human rights. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights would provide an underlying structure of shared values for the international order by defining universal rights for individual people. While the drafting commission solicited proposals and investigated theories for this practice of human rights, the politics of displaced person and refugee care, of repatriation and resettlement, provided tangible grounds on which a practical understanding of human rights and the institutions necessary to protect them contrasted with discussions underway in the upper echelons of rhetoric within the international negotiation. So this practice of healthcare within the camps was a very practical institutionalization of thinking about what human rights would look like. In the post-war language, the public responsibility for health that had been articulated in interwar projects became a right to health. Andrea Stempar returned to chair the World Health Organization Commission that was tasked with planning the new organization and carrying on international health until the WHO was fully operational. He persuaded the planning committee to consider interwar legacies, especially pertaining to social medicine and expanding public responsibility for health. He noted that the interwar institution had, quote, extended from the negative aspects of public health, vaccination, and other specific means of combating infection, to the positive aspects, i.e., the improvement of public health by better food, physical education, medical care, and health insurance, unquote. The interim commission drafted a constitution for the WHO in 1946 that articulated these principles as a right. The 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights then echoed this antecedent. So in conclusion, during the interwar years, civic participation became an important component of public health. In particular, it determined the transition of mechanisms for emergency responses to public health crises into institutions that managed long-term responsibility for public health. The participation within communities and the interaction between civil society and government institutions was necessary to construct and realize this understanding of public responsibility for health. Eventually, this set of values and practices created the space for our modern understanding of a right to health. And I will conclude it there, and I will be very happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for this wonderful and very clear and extensive talk that brought up or tied in so many local examples and experiences. So maybe before saying anything more, I would like to hear the audience and the students. I know that it's sometimes difficult to respond on the spot and ask on the spot, but we already have one question in the Q&A that I would propose that we start with to leave the others some more time to think and ask their questions. And Elias, if you see any hands, please let us know. So I will just read out the question posed by Oliver Giel, who was wondering quite at the beginning of your talk whether interwar Yugoslavia was actually rather an authoritarian monarchy more than a democracy. So this is the question. I will leave it to you to say something on it.
Yes, that is an excellent question. Very important background. So it started out with an effort to be democratic. Technically, it was the kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes. And I just use Yugoslavia as a shorthand, but under the kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, it was a monarchy, but was attempting to be democratic. And there were many conflicting ideas about what integration of the country and what political participation would look like. The Department of Public Health had a particular idea of what that would look like, which did not necessarily reflect what other ministries or branches of the government thought it would look like. And there was actually quite a lot of political tension between Stempar and other government officials, and various accusations that he was too Croatian, that he was trying to create some sort of other Balkan federation. So there was a lot of intense political dynamics at that time, and it was very unclear what democracy would look like. But there was a clear effort to build democracy. And that's one of the really interesting things about that early period after the First World War. All of these countries were suddenly formed, were told that they were going to be democracies, but they had to actually build democracy. The governments didn't know what democracy looked like, and the populations didn't know what democracy looked like. And many of the populations didn't even realize or weren't even convinced that they wanted to be part of the states that they were now part of. So it was a very intense democracy building experiment that happened through a lot of different venues, and public health was a major part of that. Yugoslavia, toward the end of the 1920s, had a coup and became authoritarian. And Stempar briefly stayed on and briefly tried to keep his projects going, but he was pushed out in 1931. So he was there for about 2 years under the authoritarian government. He had a reasonably good relationship with the king, and that seems to have protected his position somewhat, although he had a lot of other opponents within the government. So then once he could no longer pursue a democratic experiment within Yugoslavia, that was when he accepted the invitation to join the League of Nations Health Organization. And this was also a frequent pattern across Central and Eastern Europe as countries, as democratic experiments failed and countries became increasingly authoritarian, a number of experts transitioned to working with international organizations. So ironically, the increasing nationalization in Europe actually advanced international institutions, and many of them became advisors to places elsewhere in the world that were pursuing democratic experiments to some degree, such as China. They also advised the United States. I'm fond of this part. Stempar was very determined about what was wrong with democracy in the United States and the different public health initiatives that could fix that. He had a lot of advice and very little of it was listened to.
Thank you, Sarah, for this response. This is really great. And also what I took, I think, from your talk is really that, I mean, what you show is that democracy is never finished. Like, it's a processual thing. It's an experiment. We cannot be sure just because our state is called a democracy that it actually is. So I think it is very important also to have a look at this through time as you do, but also ask ourselves for the present, okay, what does it actually mean? And if we think of, as you do and show us, democracy as a relation and an experiment rather than a fixed thing, what does it look like today? So what are the relations between state and the citizens? And these are not direct relations, as you show. They can be very much in a specific way in the domain of public health, but very differently in the domain of interior security or whatever. So I think this is very important for us to think about it and what particular place maybe public health can also have in this. And as we're opening up, as I understood from Thomas, to maybe more positive or beyond crisis thinking, it is really, I think, important that we take this very local story about participation and about education as something which was taken up and actively constructed by people, by communities very seriously, and ask, okay, what would this mean for today and for here, for a very different world, I guess. Yeah.
Yes, you put that very well. And I especially would emphasize, as you say, the significance of the local element. In all of these different public health projects that I have investigated in my research, including the ones that I mentioned today, but others as well, there was a clear effort to involve the local population. And part of this was because of that thinking about democracy in that moment after World War I and thinking about what citizenship actually meant. But it was also about that transition, as we were setting up the context for today, from the crisis and the control measures that often go along with crisis to thinking about what's more manageable long term. How do you protect the security of the population? How do you encourage people to think about how their actions impact others and how they might be impacted by the actions of others? And so part of this story that I tell always involves experts of various sorts with their ideas about how things should work. But there's also a lot of intensely local activity. And one of the things that the Americans notice about Stempar is that he actually talks with people. He goes into a migrant labor camp and they're shocked. He's talking with the people. But that's what he did everywhere. That's what he did in Macedonia. That's what he did in China. He kept long diaries of his conversations with people everywhere. And that's because that was part of how he understood social medicine and public health to operate. You hear what the people have to say about their communities, and you ask them what they would want to do to improve life in their communities. And then you help them with what it is they choose to do. And so it's very local, but also very integrated at different levels and integrated between these different communities as well. So communities in Yugoslavia would note to Stempar that they were following news of what was happening in China. So this is also a moment when people were also becoming more aware through the media of what was happening elsewhere. It wasn't as though they were completely cut off from one another because they don't have the social media that we have today. So there was a lot of thinking about what integration looks like at different levels, from the local to the global, through the official channels, but also just through the communities of the people as well. So that comes back to the civil society idea that there's a lot that comes out of the values and activity of the community itself, and how that community is defined can vary between a very small village to a much larger region or even global civil society.
Thank you. So are there any questions from the audience? Please raise your hands. You can also feel free to ask your question in German. We will do our best to translate or put your questions in the Q&A. Sara is here to respond, and we are here to discuss together. So don't be shy.
So if I may, while the students make up their minds, Sara, for me as an outsider to your area of expertise, you used a couple of phrases that I'm not that familiar with. For example, participatory citizenship. To me, that's an oxymoron. And in a way you addressed this already, because citizenship means that you have both freedom as well, to me, you have both freedom as well as responsibilities. Well, what is, in your words, the difference to participatory citizenship?
Participatory citizenship, I use as a term to signify greater activity, so that it's not simply a sort of passive citizenship, but it, in some ways, it incorporates that idea of responsibility that you mentioned. But it's also about the idea that a democracy only functions if people make active choices within it. When people think the democracy is just going to function because of the institutions, then those institutions can fail. The participatory element suggests that people actively make choices about what they believe is important, about how these institutions should function, about what these institutions should do. And so the public health projects, like the one in Macedonia, enacted that on a very local level, which then had greater significance at higher levels of institutions. So a village deciding what type of well they wanted or what kind of clinic they wanted, would translate into how the Department of Public Health functioned. And it also then transferred into how Stempar was able to decentralize the public health programs so that they weren't all controlled from Belgrade. So these simple choices and decisions on the part of people in very local communities help to build the institutions more broadly. Part of the idea is also that by participating in these very immediate ways where people can see the impact instantly, it also builds their experience of thinking about politics that might be more abstracted from their lives, which is part of what I see in that example from Rebecca West when she was touring Macedonia, that these people in this village had a very specific concern about their water supply, but then once it was addressed, they also had opinions about broader political issues, and they wanted to voice that. And I think that fact that they expected this civil servant from Belgrade to listen to them was in part a result of their experience working with these government officials, because according to reports from 10 years earlier, a community like this would not have trusted any government officials from Belgrade. They would have considered them to be foreign and would not have expected anything from them.
What I learned, Janina, if I may, what I learned from your presentation was also that we perhaps sometimes underestimate the role of cultural differences in responses to exhortations of a government or a healthcare official. And it reminded me of a talk by the presentation last week by Anne Kelly, who actually carved out the importance of the role of anthropologists, basically ambassadors between cultures, or whatever you like to call them, in fostering this societal communication as one way of addressing the consequences of a health crisis. And when I listened to your vivid examples from China as well as from the Balkan region, I was reminded of that.
And in a way, this Stempar was an anthropologist. Like, if you listen to people, he translated things. He was sort of maybe broker of culture and politics. We could see him like this. And by the way, somebody asked in the chat, how do you spell his name? So that maybe people can look it up also.
I will write it into the chat.
In your readings. And so if you just would put his name in the chat, maybe that would be great. So we can all trace it.
You have just to change to, okay, you send it to everybody.
Okay, great. And if I may, I just had another thought also on, I mean, linking it back to the present in two ways, in a way, because what you said about public health being one domain of shaping citizen-state relations. And I mean, I did research in Spain very recently, a few years ago, before the COVID crisis, but during the austerity crisis, you know, and what people said when they like protested massively on the streets of Madrid and in other cities in Spain against the cutting of public health care in the name of austerity was, okay, this is not only about what kind of healthcare we want, it is about what kind of society we want. And I think this holds still true for today. And this is really interesting also in a place like Spain, where the state has a very ambivalent meaning. I mean, they've just been 40 years out after dictatorship, but still, you know, the state is not trusted as such, but in some domains it is, and it is needed. So I think it also what you nicely show, and what we see also today in different countries, is how ambivalent these relations to the state can be, and there's no such one thing as citizen-state relations, right? And maybe just another link to the present that I wanted maybe to ask you. You might have ideas about it. I'll just put it on the table, because when you talk about the interwar years, what public health was very different than that it is imagined today. It was much broader. So you talked about water, you talked about sanitation, you talked about you know, food. When we talk of public health after COVID, we talk about what? Vaccines and maybe masks. But so where has this broad view of public health gone? And how has it, what happened that it, you know, what would you call it in English? It became so much narrower. So we have obviously now these techno solutions, these fixes, we have wonderful vaccines, but I mean, what about all this other, you know, with these other public health visions that might be one answer also to what we are going through?
Yes, it's so interesting how what public health has changed. And this is one of the things that I struggle with in my writing, how to find a term to actually convey what they thought of it as in the interwar years. I would use Stampar's socialized medicine, but that has a whole set of political baggage now that, especially in the United States, would be very hard for me to use without conveying a particular political perspective. The way I try to describe public health in the interwar years is that it was more akin to thinking around the extension of universal education and the government's role in extending education and extending it through additional levels progressively. So really, public health was part of that same idea of the state's responsibility toward its citizens and the idea of how you build citizenship or citizenry that was part of this thinking about universal education. And so the thinking about public health had to do with extending the government's and the community's responsibilities in a range of different activities that supported the health of the population. And this included healthcare. It wasn't only things like sanitation and water management. It included healthcare as part of that thinking about what public health was. Interestingly, part of how that developed was actually in the history of implementing insurance systems and making insurance mandatory in the early 20th century, because by implementing insurance, they began to recognize the range of socioeconomic conditions that impacted health and necessities for payouts from insurance. So actually, insurance paid for a lot of public health initiatives, and a lot of research was done around the sorts of social and economic issues that impacted health. So it was extremely comprehensive, and it included everything from childcare and even some education elements through the environment, the water. Agriculture was closely incorporated to actual healthcare interventions for the individual. Part of why that changed had to do with new thinkings about intervention in disease after the Second World War. So as it became more possible to actually have clinical intervention in a broader range of health conditions, then more of a distinction emerged between individualized care, which was seen as medicine, and public health, which was seen as these public mechanisms or institutions. There were different things. There were different types of thinking about public health as well that just sort of shifted in their predominance over time. So the British, for example, always had more of a sanitationist, personal hygiene approach. The Austrians, for example, always adopted more of a social medicine approach. So there were different angles that also just sort of gained or altered broader thinking as time progressed. And the politics of the Cold War also shaped some of this at the international level. So what types of activities the World Health Organization would become involved in, for example, differed from what the League of Nations Health Organization would have become involved with, because they were operating in a very different political climate.
Well, maybe I can just put out one provocation after having heard your talk. So the techno-scientific solutions that we now have, and this is not to be answered, it's really just to be thought about. So do the techno-scientific solutions we have now actually impede democracy and participation? So this would just be one thing we can think about, because of this narrowing down of what public health actually means if it's only translated on the individual level, and when we lose the whole participatory and collective aspect that was so important to your interlocutors in the interwar period. So this is just a provocation that what might want to think about.
Well, I can tell you what the ways in which Stempar and other colleagues of his responded to the development of new medications and treatments in the interwar time period, which was to think about egalitarian approaches to health beyond the state. If a particular treatment was available in Vienna, then it should also be available in Macedonia. Because you were a citizen of Austria or Yugoslavia or China should not make any difference to whether you had access to a particular treatment. And so this was one way in which they very quickly transitioned from thinking of themselves as state builders and participating in building democratic experiments on a national level to thinking about international institutions. Because in their ideas of equality, they considered it to be unethical for citizens of one state to necessarily have access to better treatment than another. So their response would have been intensely internationalist.
So are there any other questions? Have the students made up their mind and asked, do you have still, anything you want to know? We have such a specialist here on so many questions who is capable of telling us very specific details about the past, but which at the same time resonates so much with the present. So please do raise your hands or ask your questions. Otherwise, Thomas, I'm sure.
I jump in as usual.
you have.
But
otherwise,
I have
a
slightly different question. I'm curious, all the materials that you need to put into this framework of your presentation. Can you tell us very briefly, how do you source it? So Janina mentioned that you actually traveled the world. I'm sure it's an interesting approach to find the right people you interview. Are you going to libraries? And then Janina mentioned something about a private, I don't know what it was, letters or what have you. How do you go about this, finding this information, which clearly needs to cover a plethora of time, of years and eons? Tell us briefly how you do it.
It was a huge amount of paper, lots and lots of paper. So the majority of this project is based on archival resources. So mostly documents that have not been published, that are the records of particular projects or institutions or letters between individuals. And essentially I kind of tease away at threads of patterns or particular issues that begin to emerge and see where those lead. So when I started this project, I actually intended to focus only on the part, the post-war part with healthcare for displaced persons. And so I started with archives on displaced persons and refugees after World War II. And I quickly realized that they were building on experience from the interwar years, particularly because the people who were leading these initiatives were themselves displaced persons and refugees who had been part of these earlier initiatives or trained under those systems. And so I began looking into the earlier, what shaped those earlier experiences. And I was particularly interested in the interaction between national social policy and international social institutions. So I was particularly interested in this institutional approach, which led me to a particular type of archive, such as the League of Nations Health Organization's archives, the International Labor Organization, the WHO, other UN archives. And so I did a lot of my initial research in institutional archives, seeing where the interesting stories were, how they responded, who was involved. And then I began to follow up more on the side of who was involved. I began to look more at their personal papers. So many of these people collected all of the letters, all of the different reports that they had, and those often get donated to libraries or archives. And so I've read the personal papers of a number of different people who were involved in these projects. Other institutions that are kind of peripheral to the main story will also have materials. So the Rockefeller Foundation, for example, was very active in funding health projects in Europe during the interwar years. So even though I don't write explicitly about their projects, they corresponded with and funded a lot of the projects that I do look at. So their archives have a lot of material. So essentially, it's sorting through and reading a lot of papers, far more than I probably should have for a book project. It was probably overly ambitious, but it's also really interesting to see how these stories develop and these experiences develop in these different settings and circumstances. So it's hard to stop once you start following these threads.
Would you not need to speak the multiple languages at the same time? Because otherwise, to use the term that Janina said, you narrow down on English.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. So historians tend to focus more on learning to read the language than to speak, which to some extent makes it a little faster to acquire. So I have read sources in, I think it's 6 languages. I'm fortunate that the majority of these people corresponded with one another in French. Because they're working in a very international setting, corresponding with people from all over the world, French was largely the language they used. Even when corresponding with people within their own country, the Poles, for example, would often write to one another in French. However, I have also used sources, read sources in Polish and German and Croatian. And some in Yiddish. So I do incorporate those and can work with a number of different languages. And essentially my approach to them has been to focus on the areas where I can use the linguistic capabilities. I'm sure there would be different stories to be told and other examples if I were to follow up some of the colleagues of Stempar who worked in Hungary or Romania, for example. And I hope somebody else will do that someday.
I have one more question regarding the topic of this whole third part of the lecture series, which is a status quo. So you actually eloquently demonstrated the very important findings of your studies by looking back, right, between the interwar years. And I think we discussed quite vividly today the fact that democracy is not a black and white means, that it takes participatory citizenship to shape it, and that public health and the proper means can help build a stronger society in a very positive, humane aspect. Now, with all these findings and looking forward, how do you build traction around this? How do you, as a scientist, take a benefit out of it by saying, look, this is the research I did. Is someone picking it up for the better of the world? And then how do you go about it?
That is always a particularly challenging question for a historian. We're mostly comfortable talking about the past and saying what we see happened in the past rather than directly applying it to the present. But there are certain patterns or common responses to particular issues that allow us to talk about issues in the present. So for these issues such as how public health is significant to supporting democracy, how you can use community projects to build trust and counteract some of the political divisions that occur in emergency responses to public health crises. I wouldn't necessarily say, yes, we can absolutely apply what Stampar was doing and get past these controversies over mask mandates or vaccine mandates today. But I would say that in the past, we have seen how community efforts have altered and developed a sense of public responsibility for health and have helped to shape the institutions so that they aren't disconnected from the people's experience. And therefore, that's worth thinking about in current contexts. I'm particularly interested in thinking about how we move forward with issues of international health as we handle the new phase of the pandemic and future health issues at a global level. And one of the things that I think is important to recognize from this earlier period is that there were a lot of different ways of thinking about international health and global health before we sort of settled into what we have now. We have this particular idea of what the World Health Organization is, of what global health is today and how it works. But that's really a product of the second half of the 20th century. And there was a whole different set of thinking before that. And that doesn't mean that it's going to work for us to go back and adopt what they were thinking of before it. But I think it's helpful to get us out of making assumptions about things must be the way we're familiar with them. If we look at the ways other people thought about it, it can help us break free from our own assumptions and think about what a different future might look like.
All right, thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. I think these are wonderful words to close this session. Thanks to everybody for staying on. Thanks, Sara, for this really exciting and so illuminating talk. I think which pulls us right into where we are and maybe give some ideas of where we could go. Acknowledging, as you said, that it's not there's not only one way, I guess. So thanks a lot, everybody, and have a nice evening, I guess, in Vienna. And see you next week.
See you next week. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. It's been my pleasure.
Thomas,
ja.
See you all. Thomas, kündigst du noch die nächste Einheit an?
Ja, natürlich. Das nächste, just switching to German, not to be disrespectful, Sarah, but the next talk will be in German. Das nächste, danke Elias, das nächste Ringvorlesungsthema wird auch im Kontext von Status Quo sein, Wege aus der Krise. Und wir freuen uns, Professor Jörg Debertin aus Deutschland begrüßen zu können, der über das Thema Digitalisierung der Gesundheit, wie können wir damit der Krise begegnen, sprechen wird. Er ist Radiologe, Arzt, Hochschullehrer, Manager, Regierungsunterstützer und hat das Berlin Institute of Health Technology mitbegründet, wo es um Innovation im Gesundheitswesen geht. Das heißt, wir gehen dann von einer historischen Perspektive auf den sehr fast profanen, aber trotzdem dynamischen Prozess der Digitalisierung zu. Und ich freue mich, Sie nächste Woche um die gleiche Zeit begrüßen zu können.